The recent Challengers tournament has brought about a huge power shift in the upper layers of competitive Valorant. Tier 1 orgs are being upset by open bracket teams, there have been accusations of big teams trolling to sandbag placements, and notable roster shifts have made some waves in competitive Valorant over the past month. What is up, ProGuides family? It is your host, Sergeant Frost, and today we are discussing some of the more recent hot-button issues surrounding Tier 1 Valorant teams and recent VCT tournaments in Valorant. Let's not waste any more time and let's hop right into the video. Pro players from Tier 1 teams have been receiving a lot of flack recently from the community because of poor performance in big tournaments. We have started to see some of the biggest teams like Sentinels, TSM, 100 Thieves, and FaZe falter against both open qualifier Tier 2 teams and other big orgs as well. This has led to players like Shazam and Hiko talking about the problems that the VCT tournament presents to teams that participate in them. Tier 1 orgs that do well and place in the top 5 of tournaments will have targets painted on their backs. This leads to semi-pro and Tier 1 teams developing anti-strats against them and reading them well in their matches. A lot of this argument comes back to the fact that a lot of North American games are streamed for all to see, and lesser known open qualifier teams have a lot of footage to study from when it comes to preparing for these matches against these top teams. You also have to take into account that these matches are being played in such close proximity to each other that teams don't have enough time to reinvent themselves in under a month. This issue leads to teams being countered in game by other teams that study them pretty well. Another problem that arises from matches scheduled so close together is that this constant grind of tournament matches can lead to players fatigue from playing so many matches. And we all know from watching the recent BBG vs Sentinels match that this can decrease player performance significantly. The biggest thing you have to remember before you criticize teams like Sentinels and TSM for losing is that these teams like BBG and V1 have spent months watching VODs on these top teams and preparing for matches against them. These teams do not have the proper time frame to scrim, make roster changes, and reinvent themselves in order to stay dominant at the top for a long period of time. Not to mention that Valorant does not have a proper VOD system to aid pro and semi-pro teams in their efforts for collecting good footage to use to study from. Also, we have to start recognizing that Valorant has been out for almost a year now, and a lot of teams both big and small have had their hands on this game for quite a while. It was only a matter of time before smaller Tier 2 and Tier 3 teams started to find out ways to counter-strat and come up with new ways to beat more experienced, bigger teams. Remember, these semi-pro players are on good teams. V1 and the notorious BBG are salary players with multi-FPS game experience, and they certainly know how to big game prep. It's not like these semi-pro teams have players that are new to competitive FPS and Valorant is their first game. Some of these teams that you see in the tournament have players that have been competing in North American competitive FPS since the early days of CSGO. They have played with and against a lot of these players in the biggest of orgs, so it's not like these challenger tournaments are their first rodeo. If you want more help on achieving a playstyle like the pro players we talk about in this video, check out some of our courses on ProGuides.com. On our website, we have courses written by pro players that teach you the in-depth mechanics of this game and how you can improve as a player. We also have coaches online 24/7 who can help you improve your gameplay and review your VODs with you in real time. Head over to ProGuides.com today to achieve the rank of your dreams. One of the biggest criticisms of NA teams is that they lack the skill to innovate strategically in-game. These criticisms aren't just a shot in the dark at NA Valorant teams. North American esports teams ranging from League of Legends and Overwatch all the way to CSGO and Call of Duty have suffered from this lack of strategic creativity problem. My immediate analysis from watching games these past few tournaments is that the NA PUG playstyle in-game is not the most productive or consistent. And when you play teams who are disciplined and truly coordinated, this playstyle of win your gunfights and strat it out later will fail you at the worst times. Many criticisms over the years for both NA CSGO teams and Valorant teams alike is that American teams lack strategic depth in their gameplay, and the PUG or ranked style of play of going for kills and trying to pick people off in crossfires does not work against teams that have studied you and know your nuances and habits. The PUG playstyle requires your mechanics and confidence to be on 1000% when you play, and when you watch teams like Sentinels and FaZe lose, you can tell that this strategy doesn't work out well against teams that have studied more footage of you than you have yourself. If you watch the first VCT Challengers tournament, you will notice that FaZe were blowing away teams earlier in the tournament, but when they had to face Sentinels in the finals, they were a shell of their former selves, that struggled to win many rounds, if any at all. So why is this, you might ask? Well, simply put, FaZe is a mechanically gifted team with players like Baby Bay, Corey, and Marv who can do the heavy lifting in the fragging department. These are the guys who lock duelists for their team and are expected to entry frag and aim duel players from across the map to win games. They were able to steamroll the competition early in the tournament by outplaying and outmuscling other teams, but Sentinels was not having it in the finals match. FaZe looked lost the entire series, and this was mostly because they didn't know how to play with the man disadvantage, and they had no complex strats to take map control outside of being aggressive and W-king enemies while trying to win aim duels. You may not like Sentinels as of recent, but you have to admit for a team of former CSGO pros, they have carried over the slow and steady wins the race mentality from their previous careers into Valorant. Sentinels has strats for both offense and defense. They know how to properly take map control without having to take brainless aim duels with opponents in the middle of the map. And they have the luxury of having role players and 10s on their team. So each player on that roster has a specific job and they know what they should be doing at all times. I'm particularly not surprised at FaZe losing because the way they play just requires them to win their duels and play with no fear. Sentinels as a team have more tactical nuances, but they still coast by a lot by just outgunning their opponents. They need something to fall back on when they aren't hitting their shots. And honestly, the teamwork and decision making look really sketchy at times for both teams in their games. So we can all tell that it really wasn't just their aim that was failing them. Now, moving on, if we want to talk about how the EU scene is different from the NA scene in competitive Valorant, look no further than the EU Counter-Strike scene to understand how EU Valorant teams have molded and shaped their playstyle and strategies in-game. EU as a region have a much more strategic and tactical approach to the game of Valorant. The lack of tournaments gives EU teams time to innovate themselves and their strategies in the dark. That's why gameplay hacks like Viper on Icebox and Bind were able to fly under the radar for so long. European teams since the early days of CSGO pride themselves on a technique called AntiStriding. Anti-striding is where you study so much of your opponent's footage before playing them that you are able to predict their every move each round, and you meet them on the map to contest and stop them before they can execute one of their planned and developed strats. To give an example, a basic team in pro play might default on Haven to be safe since the map is so big and it's hard to tell where the attackers want to go. This default will consist of one player on C, one player in Garage, one player in B, and two players in A, one in Sight and one in Heaven. This is a standard safe default strat that the public knows. But anti-stratting, for example, would be if an entire defending team put 3 players in C site and sent 2 players up A long to get into attacker spawn. If that defending team anti-stratted properly, they would know that the attacking team likes to execute on C fast and send players up C long and into Garage to blitzkrieg the site. The anti-strat is prepared for this because the defenders have 3 players tucked into C site waiting for the attackers, and they have 2 players taking the long flank from A to trap the attackers and get free kills by shooting them in the back. Anti-stratting only works when you can study your opponent's footage so well that you find out that they like to execute these types of plays, and your team can anti-strat them by matching their every move with a proactive response. Teams like FaZe didn't have anti-strats and they got 3-0'd in embarrassing fashion in the VCT finals match. The reason Sentinels and other EU teams can dismantle lesser skilled competition is because they anti-strat so well there's literally nothing their opponents can do to stop them except abandon all of their rehearsed plays. Since January, the NA region has been bouncing from tourney to tourney, and many of the tier 2 teams are afraid of experimenting in game. This is because now many teams are getting paid salaried money and they need to produce short-term results so that they don't get dropped. These tier 2 teams clearly do a lot of work in the pre-game stratting department against the top teams, and that pre-game planning pays off in spades, as you can see in the Sentinels vs BBG game. It also doesn't help that players can suffer from mental burnout because of how rigorous these tournament formats truly are. Before we move on, we have to get to our question of the day. Today's question is, do you think there should be more space between the VCT Challenger tournaments, or do you like how close the competition already is? Personally, I think there should be more space between tournaments so that teams can prepare properly and make the long-term roster moves that they deem necessary. Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Now, let's get right back into the video. For our final part of the video, we have to talk about NA roster moves and how 6-man rosters can potentially affect the NA scene. There have been some really big roster changes in the past 2 months, and it has shaken up the NA competitive scene a lot. First off, Brax going to TSM might be one of the biggest power moves for a tier 1 roster in 2021. Brax is a consistent rifler that can play a support and a main frag playstyle as we have seen in the past. The question now is, does TSM set the precedent in NA by creating a 6-man roster that swaps out players? Or do they drop one of the other support players in Hazed or Cutler to make way for Brax? I think 6-man rosters can add a lot to the NA scene, and it adds a lot of layers to teams that are already pretty one-dimensional as it stands. Teams like FaZe, TSM, C9 Blue, Gen G, and T1 are pretty flat in terms of team playstyle. Those teams relied on their players' fragging power and clutch capabilities in order to win games and take series. Having a 6-man that you can rotate out that specializes in a certain playstyle or agent is a great addition to the roster. Introducing 6-man rosters means opposing teams will now have to account for an X-Factor player when it comes to studying opposing teams. Other big notable roster changes include automatic leaving CSGO and coming over to Valorant on the T1 roster. Also, don't forget about 100 Thieves sidelining DiceyX for solid CSGO AWPer in Ethan. And last but not least, we all have obviously seen the effects of what TENS has done for Sentinels. It will be interesting to see in the future if Sentinels straight up pays his buyout to keep him on this dominant roster even longer. Well everyone, that is all we have for the problems currently with Tier 1 Valorant. If you liked the video, then be sure to drop a like and consider subscribing if you enjoy the content. We upload new videos just like this one every single day, and the best way to stay notified of that is by ringing that notification bell. Don't forget to check out our website, ProGuides.com, to gain some access to some truly amazing coaching. Remember to stay safe out there, and I will see you all again very soon.